Late at night, in a quiet Virginia town, two police officers set in motion a chain of events that would unravel their entire careers. The night was still, with the hum of streetlights flickering above the deserted sidewalks. Occasionally, a car sped down the empty streets, breaking the silence. In the midst of the calm, Talia Porter, a woman with a purpose, drove through Arlington's suburban streets, her sleek black SUV slicing through the quiet. It was just past midnight when Talia glanced at her watch. She'd had a long day, but she felt a small sense of accomplishment. Her undercover work in this small town was nearing its end, and she had everything she needed for a clean exit. As she neared a quiet intersection, her sharp eyes caught the faint glint of a reflective stop sign. Talia had a talent for noticing the smallest details, a skill honed over years of working as a CIA field operative. With practiced precision, she slowed the SUV to a stop, her hands steady on the wheel. Talia felt the familiar calmness that came with every operation, no matter how routine. Just as she was about to turn left onto the next street, the unmistakable flash of blue and red lights reflected off her rearview mirror. The siren's piercing wail shattered the stillness of the night. Talia's heart didn't race. She was trained for moments like this. Her breathing was steady, her mind sharpened to a razor's edge. She glanced into the mirror and saw the squad car closing in. Its headlights cast long shadows across her dashboard. With deliberate calm, she guided the car to the side of the road, turned off the engine, and reached for her glove compartment to retrieve her license and registration. The squad car stopped behind her, lights still flashing. Talia could see two officers stepping out. Their movements were deliberate, calculated. The driver, a tall man with a square jaw and authoritative gait, approached first. His partner, shorter and stockier, followed closely behind. Both wore the standard navy blue uniforms of the Arlington Police Department, their badges gleaming under the streetlights. "Good evening, ma'am," the driver said, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone used to taking control. He leaned down slightly, shining his flashlight into Talia's window, the beam sweeping across her face and interior. "You know why I pulled you over tonight?" Talia kept her expression neutral, her gaze meeting his without hesitation. "No, officer, I wasn't speeding, and I made a full stop at the intersection." The officer's lips twitched, a small, condescending smile tugging at the corners. "Actually, you failed to stop at that sign back there," he said, his tone turning accusatory. "That's a moving violation." Talia's brow furrowed ever so slightly, but she kept her composure. "I'm certain I stopped, officer," she said, her voice calm yet firm. "If you're mistaken—" "License and registration," the officer interrupted, his tone hardening. Talia handed over her documents without a second thought. Her movements were slow and deliberate. She had no intention of allowing this stop to escalate into something unnecessary. The officer examined her papers, his eyes lingering on her license. He processed her identity. Virginia plates, local address. It seemed normal, but Talia could sense his scrutiny. "You live around here?" the officer asked, almost as if speaking to himself. Talia nodded. "Yes, officer." At that moment, Officer Sullivan, who had been lingering near the rear of the SUV, called out, "Hey, Carter, you might want to take a look back here." The driver, Officer Carter, straightened, passing Talia's documents back to her without comment. "Stay in the car," he ordered, his voice firm, before turning to join his partner at the trunk. Talia's jaw tightened as she watched them through her side mirror. Officer Sullivan was pointing at something, his voice low and conspiratorial. Carter nodded, and the two officers exchanged a glance. Talia's instincts flared, a warning, not fear, but a sharp and unmistakable sense that something was wrong. Moments later, Carter returned to her window, his expression now grim. "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am." Talia tilted her head slightly, her voice calm but questioning. "May I ask why, officer?" "We've got reason to believe you're in possession of illegal substances," Carter replied, his tone hard, almost rehearsed. Talia's eyes narrowed. "Illegal substances?" "I think you know what we're talking about," Carter said, gesturing for her to exit the vehicle. Sullivan was already standing near the back of the SUV, a smug look on his face. Talia suppressed a sigh. This was no simple traffic stop. This was a setup. Talia opened the door and stepped out of the vehicle, her movements unhurried, deliberate. She made no attempt to hide her composure, despite the pressure mounting around her. Every step she took was calculated, every action purposeful. She stood with her hands at her sides, watching as Sullivan theatrically opened the trunk of her SUV, lifting the lid with exaggerated care. His eyes gleamed with satisfaction. "There it is," Sullivan said with mock surprise. "What do you know?" "A bag of powdery goodness." Talia's eyes flicked toward the bag, but she didn't react outwardly. Instead, her mind raced. That bag hadn't been there when she left her house. She was certain of it. This was no random find. It was planted. A setup, plain and simple. The officers had miscalculated, assuming she'd panic. But Talia Porter didn't panic. Carter moved closer, a smirk playing at the corners of his lips. "Anything you want to tell us, ma'am?" Talia's lips curved into the faintest of smiles, the kind that conveyed neither guilt nor fear. "I'll save my comments for the appropriate setting," she said coolly, her voice steady and unflinching. Carter chuckled, clearly interpreting her calm demeanor as arrogance. "Oh, you'll have your chance. You're under arrest for possession with intent to distribute." Sullivan was already moving to cuff her. Talia didn't resist. She knew better. Resistance would only escalate the situation, and right now, she needed to control the narrative. She allowed him to snap the cuffs into place, her gaze unwavering. "You're making a big mistake," she said softly, the words carrying an intensity that made Sullivan hesitate for a split second before snapping the cuffs tighter. "We'll see," Carter said, his voice dripping with smug confidence as he gestured for Talia to follow him to the squad car. "Let's see how confident you are in front of a judge." As the officers drove her to the station, the silence in the car was almost suffocating. The only sounds that filled the air were the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the police radio. Talia sat in the back seat, her hands cuffed behind her, her expression as neutral as ever. The fluorescent glow of passing streetlights painted fleeting shadows across her face, but her gaze remained fixed on the road ahead. Inwardly, her thoughts were sharp and deliberate. Every detail of the encounter replayed in her mind like pieces of a puzzle coming together. The stop sign that didn't exist, the officer's smug confidence, the bag that had been planted. It wasn't just a random act of corruption. It was calculated, rehearsed. These weren't mistakes. They were deliberate choices made by men who thought they could get away with it. Officer Carter glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his lips curling into a faint smirk. "You don't seem too worried," he said, breaking the silence. Talia met his eyes through the mirror, her gaze unflinching. "Should I be?" she asked calmly. Carter chuckled, shaking his head. "You're either brave or stupid, lady. I've seen a lot of people act tough, but it never lasts long in the holding cell." Talia didn't respond. She didn't need to. She knew men like Carter all too well. Men used to power, used to bending the rules to their advantage, used to walking away without consequence. But for now, she let him believe he was in control. That illusion wouldn't last. When they arrived at the station, the quiet hum of activity filled the air. Officers were lounging behind desks, sipping coffee, and chatting in low voices. Carter and Sullivan led Talia inside, the harsh glare of fluorescent lights illuminating the scuffed linoleum floors and peeling paint of the walls. Talia's eyes took in every detail: the layout of the station, the placement of the cameras, the subtle interactions between officers. It was a small station, the kind where everyone knew everyone, a network of shared secrets and unspoken codes. "We got ourselves a big one tonight," Carter announced loudly, his voice brash, drawing the attention of the others. Sullivan tossed the bag of powder onto the counter with a theatrical flip. "Caught her red-handed," he added, his tone filled with mock triumph. "Looks like she's been running more than stop signs." Talia remained silent. She didn't need to defend herself. The truth would come out soon enough. She noted the tension in the room, the way the officers exchanged glances, as if waiting for something to happen. But the storm was coming, and they had no idea. The younger officer at the fingerprinting station hesitated when Talia placed her hands on the ink pad. He glanced at her, an uneasy look in his eyes. There was something about her that didn't quite match the typical suspects who passed through the station, but his training told him to follow procedure, so he complied without comment. "Name?" he asked, his voice almost apologetic. "Talia Porter," she replied evenly. "Occupation?" Talia hesitated for just a moment, considering her answer carefully. "Consultant," she said, the word vague enough to pass scrutiny, but truthful enough to avoid outright deception. The officer nodded, his unease still palpable. But Carter and Sullivan were oblivious, laughing quietly as they leaned against the counter, enjoying the show. Talia's calmness seemed to bother them, and it only spurred them on. "You've got a smart mouth," Carter said, his voice darkening. "Let's see how funny you are, after a night in lockup." The cell Talia was led to was cold and dimly lit. The metal bench bolted to the wall, offering little comfort. The faint hum of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as she sat on the bench, her back straight, her posture unyielding. The door slammed shut behind her with a sound that echoed down the hallway, and she was left alone in the quiet, waiting. Carter lingered outside for a moment, watching her with a mix of curiosity and disdain. "You don't look like the type to get mixed up in this kind of thing," he said almost conversationally. "But don't worry, the courts love a good sob story. Maybe they'll go easy on you." Talia tilted her head slightly, her eyes locking onto his. "Or maybe they'll see through yours," she said, her voice calm but sharp. Carter muttered something under his breath and walked away, leaving her alone in the cell. Talia leaned back against the cold metal wall, exhaling slowly. She knew her next steps had to be precise. She wasn't just fighting for her own freedom, she was about to expose something much bigger. The quiet of the cell was broken only by the faint hum of the station's HVAC system. Talia waited, patient and calm, knowing that her absence would be noticed soon enough. When it was, questions would be asked, and her team would find her. They always did. In the meantime, she had to play the part. The unremarkable woman with nothing to hide, but with everything to reveal. The hours passed slowly in the cold cell. Talia sat still on the bench, her back straight, her eyes half closed, as if she were meditating. She wasn't tired. Sleep was a luxury she rarely indulged in during missions. Her mind was sharp, always calculating, always anticipating. She listened intently to the sounds of the station, every faint noise carrying meaning. The murmurs of officers, the beeping of station computers, the faint crackle of the radio. Each detail mattered, and Talia was cataloging them all. She knew that her absence from the streets would soon be noticed, and when that happened, questions would begin to arise. Her team would find her, just like they always did. But until then, she had to play the role of the calm, composed detainee, an unremarkable woman with nothing to hide. The station's night shift officers moved around the station, their footsteps familiar, their voices soft as they shared quiet conversations over cups of coffee. But Talia wasn't fooled. She knew that beneath the routine, something much more dangerous was brewing. She could feel it in the tension of the air and the shift in energy around her. In the break room, Carter and Sullivan sat with their steaming mugs of coffee, their laughter filling the small space. But Talia knew that the smug confidence they wore was beginning to crack. Sullivan leaned back in his chair, a knowing grin on his face. "She thinks she's untouchable," he said, shaking his head, as if he could see straight through her calm demeanor. "Did you see her face?" Not even a flicker of panic. Carter didn't look up from his cup, but he was listening. "Well, that'll change soon enough. She'll be singing a different tune once she's in lockup," he said, his voice dripping with false confidence. The younger officer at the desk, Officer James Keller, couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. He had processed dozens of arrests in his few months on the job, but this one felt different. The woman in the holding cell wasn't like the others. She wasn't defiant or aggressive, but she wasn't scared either. Her calmness, her deliberate words were unsettling. And then there was the bag of drugs, a little too convenient, almost too perfect, as if it had been placed there for them to find. He glanced at the monitor showing Talia in her cell, the flickering footage providing a distorted image of her stillness. She sat with an eerie composure, her eyes never wavering. Keller's finger hovered nervously over his keyboard, unsure of what to do. He had been trained to recognize patterns in criminal behavior, but this situation didn't fit any of the usual patterns. His instincts told him something was wrong, but he wasn't sure how to prove it. He pulled up Talia's arrest file and scanned through the details. The narrative was familiar: stopped for failure to yield, a nervous suspect, consent to search granted, and the discovery of controlled substances. But something felt off. The report seemed too neat, too scripted. It didn't add up. Keller swallowed hard, his thoughts racing. He'd seen enough cases to know when things didn't make sense, but he was new, just a rookie in a station that had its own unspoken rules. He had been taught not to question senior officers, to follow the chain of command. But now, standing on the precipice of doing what he knew was right, Keller couldn't ignore the unease in his chest. He watched as Carter and Sullivan laughed in the break room, their carefree demeanor grating against his growing discomfort. The station felt heavier than usual, the air thicker with tension. Something was off, and Keller could feel it in his bones. Back in the holding cell, Talia's mind worked in overdrive, analyzing every detail, every interaction. She knew that the officers had no idea who they were dealing with. They were too confident, too comfortable in their abuse of power. But they had made one critical mistake. They underestimated her. She sat perfectly still on the metal bench, her eyes trained on the small camera above her cell. It was an old model, poorly maintained, a relic of a station that hadn't updated its technology in years. She knew it wouldn't be long before her team located her. They always did. And when that happened, everything would change. In the station's break room, Carter and Sullivan continued their conversation, oblivious to the storm that was coming. "She's probably sitting in there thinking we're going to crack her," Carter said, shaking his head with a chuckle. "They always think they can talk their way out of it." "Yeah, well, she's in for a rude awakening," Sullivan replied, leaning back in his chair, clearly convinced that their setup would go undetected. But neither of them noticed the young officer standing quietly by the desk, his face pale, his eyes darting toward Talia's holding cell. Keller's internal conflict grew with every passing minute. He knew something wasn't right, but he didn't know where to start. All he had was a growing sense of unease and a nagging feeling that he was standing on the edge of something bigger than he could imagine. The station's routine continued, but for Keller, nothing felt normal anymore. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was in the middle of something he didn't fully understand. The clock was ticking, and he knew he had to act, but he didn't know how. The morning shifted into the rhythm of routine, but the atmosphere in the station felt heavy, oppressive. The hum of the fluorescent lights, the buzz of radios, and the occasional murmur of conversations filled the air. But there was an undeniable tension that had settled in the station. In the midst of it all, Talia sat in her cell, still as ever, her mind working in overdrive, anticipating every move. Keller, seated at his desk, found himself more and more drawn to the events unfolding in the holding cells. His instincts were telling him something was off, but his training held him back. He knew better than to question the senior officers. Carter and Sullivan were experienced, seasoned officers with impeccable track records, at least on the surface. But the longer Keller stared at the report, the more uneasy he became. The arrest narrative was too clean, too convenient, a little too perfect for his liking. His mind raced, searching for the crack in the facade that could bring the whole thing crumbling down. He knew he had to dig deeper, but he couldn't risk drawing attention to himself. As he scanned through the records on his computer, his eyes darted between the arrest files of Carter and Sullivan, noticing a disturbing pattern, minor violations leading to bigger charges, mostly involving people of color. Each case had its own set of discrepancies, small yet telling. It was a trail of corruption that had been buried for too long. Keller's heart pounded as he connected the dots. The planted evidence in Talia's car wasn't an isolated incident. This was bigger than one arrest. It was part of a systemic problem. He couldn't ignore it any longer. He needed to do something, but the fear of retaliation held him back. He glanced around, his eyes settling on Carter and Sullivan, who were laughing in the break room, oblivious to his growing suspicion. As the day wore on, Keller's resolve hardened. He couldn't be complicit in this. He knew what he had to do. He had to take the first step, no matter the cost. In the break room, Carter and Sullivan continued to drink their coffee, their laughter now a bit more strained, their smugness faltering. The weight of what was happening outside their small circle was beginning to seep into their actions. Carter glanced at Sullivan, a flicker of unease in his eyes. "You think Keller's going to say something?" he asked, his tone casual, but there was a hint of concern beneath it. Sullivan shrugged, trying to dismiss the thought. "Kid's just overthinking it. He's fresh out of the academy. He won't do anything. He's too green to question us." But Carter wasn't convinced. There was something in Keller's eyes the last time they spoke, something that hinted he wasn't as naive as he appeared. Carter's gut told him that the rookie was starting to see through their game. The thought nagged at him, but he pushed it aside. For now, everything was under control. Back in her cell, Talia remained patient, her eyes flicking to the camera once more, Her team was out there, and the time was almost right. She could feel the shift in the air, the impending storm that was about to hit. Her calm exterior hid the intensity of her thoughts. She knew the FBI was already mobilizing, waiting for the right moment to make their move. But it wasn't just about her. The officers needed to be exposed, and everything had to be perfectly timed. And holding cells, we're conducting a federal investigation. The sergeant hesitated, his brow furrowing. There was something about the FBI's sudden presence that made everyone uneasy. "What's this about?" he asked, his voice wary. "Federal investigation?" Price replied, his voice unyielding. "We need access immediately." The sergeant, after a moment of hesitation, gestured toward the hallway. "Follow me." Keller watched as Price and his team moved through the station with precision, their steps measured and purposeful. The FBI agents moved like a well-oiled machine, and Keller felt a sense of relief mixed with dread. The truth was coming to light. But the real question was how far the fallout would spread. As the agents moved toward the interrogation rooms, Keller's mind raced. The storm was no longer a distant rumble. It was here, and it was going to change everything. In the break room, Carter and Sullivan continued their conversation, unaware of the impending danger. But there was no denying it now. Their time was running out. The air in the station seemed to grow heavier as the FBI agents moved through the building, their presence a stark contrast to the usual calm of the police station. Officer Keller stood frozen at his desk, his fingers trembling as he watched Agent Price and his team move with calculated precision. It was clear that the investigation had begun in earnest, and there was no turning back now. Talia sat in her cell, a small smirk playing at the corners of her lips. She could sense the shift in the atmosphere, the subtle ripples of change that ran through the station. Her patience, cultivated over years of field work, was about to pay off. She knew her team was moving in, and the time to act was fast approaching. Back in the break room, Carter and Sullivan's laughter had died down. The sudden arrival of the FBI agents had put them on edge. The tension was palpable, and neither of them could ignore the nagging feeling in their gut. Something was happening, something bigger than they had anticipated. They tried to brush it off, but deep down, they both knew. They were in trouble. Carter glanced toward the hallway, his face pale. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. His earlier bravado had all but evaporated. Sullivan leaned back, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. "I don't know, but I don't like it," he muttered, the unease growing in his voice. Meanwhile, Keller couldn't shake the feeling that his every move was being watched. He kept his eyes on the agents as they made their way to the back of the station, toward the holding cells. His heart raced. This was the moment he had been waiting for. His decision had been made, and there was no going back. The agents entered the interrogation room, where Carter and Sullivan were waiting. Agent Price, the lead investigator, stood tall and unyielding, his presence commanding. He placed a folder filled with evidence on the table between him and the two officers, his eyes never leaving theirs. "I'll ask again," Price said, his voice sharp. "Do you want to start with the arrest report, or should we go straight to the planted evidence?" Sullivan's eyes flickered toward Carter, a nervous look crossing his face. "We don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice shaky, trying to maintain his composure. "We were securing evidence." Price's lips curled into a faint smile. "Really? Because these timestamps show otherwise," he said, pulling out a series of photos. "These images from the station's security cameras show you two holding the unmarked bag before Talia Porter's car was even searched." Sullivan's face drained of color as he saw the photos spread across the table. He looked at Carter, but his partner's confidence had evaporated. There was no denying the evidence now. Price continued, his tone unwavering. "And we have audio recordings, captured by Miss Porter's hidden surveillance device, that clearly document your conversation about how easy it would be to frame her." Sullivan swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he gripped the edge of the table. "You can't use that," he stammered. "That's entrapment." Agent Price raised an eyebrow, his expression cool and unflinching. "No," he said firmly. "It's justice." Sullivan's last shred of defiance crumbled as he buried his face in his hands. Carter's bravado, once so strong, shattered in an instant. The weight of their actions hit them both like a ton of bricks. They had thought they were invincible, but now they were caught. Their lies had unraveled, and the truth had come flooding in. Outside the interrogation room, Keller stood at his desk, watching the scene unfold through the glass. His stomach churned with a mix of relief and dread. He had done the right thing, but now he had to face the consequences. The truth was finally out, but the fallout had only just begun. Talia, in the meantime, remained composed in her cell. She had been waiting for this moment, the moment when the truth would come to light and the corrupt officers would be held accountable. She knew this was just the beginning. The FBI had everything they needed to expose the officers' long history of misconduct, and she had done her part. The door to her cell buzzed open, and an agent stepped inside. His expression was respectful, his tone neutral. "Miss Porter," he said, "you're free to go." Talia stood, her movements graceful and deliberate. She met the agent's gaze, nodding slightly in acknowledgement. As she walked past Keller's desk, their eyes met briefly. Keller opened his mouth to speak, but hesitated. The words stuck in his throat. Talia stopped in her tracks, turning to face him. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice carrying a quiet but powerful gratitude. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a recognition of the risk Keller had taken in helping to expose the truth. Keller's heart raced as he nodded, his mind spinning. He didn't know what would come next, but for the first time since joining the force, he felt like he had done something that mattered. As Talia stepped outside the station, the weight she had carried for so long began to lift. Justice had been served. The corrupt officers who had thought they could get away with their crimes had been exposed, and the truth had triumphed. The storm that had been brewing for so long had finally arrived, and it had left a trail of devastation in its wake. The news of the arrests quickly spread, the story dominating headlines across the country. The charges against Talia were officially dropped, and the cases tied to the officers' misconduct were reopened. Carter and Sullivan's careers were over, their reputations destroyed. The FBI's investigation had uncovered a web of lies and corruption that had infected the station for years. In the days that followed, the Arlington Police Department was rocked by the scandal. Several officers resigned under scrutiny, and the department underwent a massive overhaul. The chief of police held a press conference, pledging to restore trust and transparency within the force. But the damage had already been done. The public had seen the truth, and nothing would ever be the same. As for Talia, she returned to her quiet life, her mission complete. But the impact of her actions lingered. She had exposed the corruption that had been festering for years, and she had ensured that justice prevailed. The storm had passed, but the ripples of her actions would continue to be felt for a long time. Weeks later, in a small diner, Talia met with Keller. The atmosphere was calm, a stark contrast to the chaos they had both endured. Keller sat across from her, still grappling with the weight of everything that had happened. "I wasn't sure you'd show up," Keller admitted, his voice low. Talia smirked, taking a sip of her coffee. "You earned this conversation," she said. "Not many people would have done what you did." Keller looked down at his coffee, conflicted. I couldn't keep looking the other way," he said, his voice faltering. "But honestly, I don't know if it made a difference. The department's still a mess, and people like Carter and Sullivan, they're still out there." Talia's gaze softened as she looked at him. "It made a difference," she said firmly. "It made a difference to the people they hurt. And it made a difference to you. Don't underestimate that." Keller allowed himself a small smile, the weight on his shoulders lifting ever so slightly. Talia leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. "Now, I move on to the next mission," she said. "There's always another fight."